historically, the European system has been focusing on free allocation of certificates to heavy industry, basically, in order to keep up competitiveness of these sectors. Now the idea was to move away from free allocation to full auctioning, which has some benefits as well distributionally, let's say, keeping the money with the member states and not with the industry, and instead moving towards carbon border adjustment, which substitutes for the free allocation, plus is seen very favorably by the European Commission because it might generate a new revenue stream for the EU, because there is discussion how to use the money from the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Potentially this should be given to the EU, which would be an argument, at least, from let's say a political economy point of view, to have this. So there is a broad agreement to move from free allocation to carbon border adjustment. It's not clear how fast this should be and to what extent the two instruments should be placed next to each other for a transitionary period of time. Okay. Plus, I should as well add that from a German perspective, it's not clear whether this is really a clever policy. Why? Because if we talk about border carbon adjustment mechanisms, it's relatively clear that this can be only levied on imports. So, so additional taxes on imports, but there will be no exemptions for exports, which means in Germany, which is an export-oriented economy, we are not so much interested in taxes on imports because we want to export our stuff, but we cannot get exemptions for exports because this is most likely forbidden by WTO rules. So there is not a big support of border carbon adjustment by German industry, and as well not by German government. Okay, that might explain why I would guess that we will not see a broad application of border carbon adjustment mechanisms in Europe because of these because of these economic considerations, and also because, of course, with, let's say, multi-level value chains, it will be as well very difficult to be implemented. So most likely, you will see this instrument relatively targeted for some sectors that are easy to trace and are in no danger of causing major trade conflicts with other trading partners, okay? Which means that as I said, I've been doing a lot of papers on this stuff, but I think it will not really fly. It's official position of the Commission, no, but I mean, now we are talking a bit in a semi-public context. No? So my observation would be that yes, we will see that it's going to be there, but it will be difficult to really phase out free allocation, and it will be really difficult to apply it on a broader scale because, as I said, Germany and other countries might not be fully convinced about the instrument, and it's going to be very complex to implement anyways in real terms. And that means the German government, for example, tries to initiate an alternative which is labeled Climate Club. So Global Climate Club, a bit like the idea that was, I think, now brought in line with Nordhaus. So thinking about a group of countries that agrees on more stringent climate policy and putting more effort on building common obligations or comparable obligations of a group of members of these climate clubs. Okay, making the need for these carbon adjustments to outsiders less important. Okay, and that is why, for example, in the recent G7 meeting, the German government has initiated or has put forward this idea of a carbon club as one of the main policy initiatives under the G7 umbrella. Okay, the idea, of course, the more we are convincing other big trading partners of agreeing on more stringent climate regulation, the less we need these border carbon adjustment measures. Okay, so this was a bit run up of what I wanted to show you. Okay, good. Let's see whether I'm going to tackle whatever I want to do. There are, of course, impact assessments of bits and pieces. What would happen to the carbon price if we implement the 55%? What would happen on the power sector? What would happen on coal generation? What would happen on renewables? It's clear that, of course, these increased targets from 40 to 55 and potentially to 60%, including an improvement of targets for the ETS, is going to boost carbon prices. It's going to lead to a coal phase out, relatively rapid coal phase out in Europe, and an increase in renewable generation. Now, all these assessments have been done in 2021. So this is all done before the war against Ukraine and the massive impact it has on fossil fuel prices, especially on gas prices, which means that some of these things I would think are no longer valid. We can talk about this in the Q&A session afterwards, but it's clear that, for example, the German coal phase out, which I was more or less convinced would happen automatically by market forces in the course of the 2020s, is not going to happen because of the high gas prices and, of course, the strictness of security. Energy security concerns in Germany. And the same might happen on the European scale. So coal might be able to deal also with high carbon prices, given the actual prices of gas that we are seeing and electricity that we are seeing on the markets. Now they can stay competitive. And the coal phase out is no longer, let's say, a market outcome, but it might happen that we see much more coal in Europe than we initially expected, also in the impact assessments. I show you here the impact assessments. Then again, in other dimensions, it might help the agenda. There are some things where I'm going to talk a bit about resilience, where this idea of resilience of the energy system might go hand in hand with policies that help us to deal with the Russian aggression. For example, energy efficiency policies or renewable policies, which are more or less aligned with these new developments. On the other hand, as I said, it's the question of coal. And I'm going to talk as well a bit about the question of new infrastructure, especially liquefied gas, so LNG terminals, and potential changes in pipeline systems that might, of course, as well lock in some of the fossil fuels over longer periods. Okay, so starting point, 55%. Would have been a great program for renewables, for phasing out coal, for increasing efficiency, for boosting carbon prices. Now we are in another world where we see that, well, this coal phase out might be more difficult. There are as well some policies that might be reinforced, like renewables, like efficiency. But there are as well some trade-offs in coal generation, in infrastructure. And we as well see that implementing some of the carbon pricing mechanisms is practically impossible given the current situation on energy markets. Okay, so one of the aspects that was just voted down last week was a pricing system for the non-ETS sectors, transport, building, which was already in the negotiation totally watered down. I was very negative about the proposal because I think it's not really fitting for the ambitions that we are having. But even this was not agreed in Parliament. So the proposal that was on the table has seen a separate pricing system for the non-ETS sectors with a price cap of 50 euro, which is, of course, not really helping us achieving the targets. You know, even the ETS prices are higher at the moment. Plus, it was only intended to cover industry, so not the private sector. Okay, which means they try to shelter individuals as far as possible, which I understand from a political point of view. But if you want to bring market-driven incentives to consumers, then of course there is no other way around of using instruments like carbon pricing. And we have to keep in mind all these negotiations now would come into effect in the second half of this decade, so from 2026. The carbon pricing proposal, even from 2029, okay, voted down, but even, I mean, we talk about a decade from now, where I think we will see another world on the energy markets, where I'm sure would be happy if we would have carbon price signals in place that help us with really covering the targets that we have set in these sectors. Okay, so what are we after? Well, we are after about systems that are affordable, that are green, and that are secure. And now, of course, in Europe, we have more or less focused on the greenness of our energy system. And with the war in the Ukraine, we have seen that the perspective has shifted very much to energy security concerns. And the main driver at the moment is energy security. So it's really about making our energy systems resilient, which means what we try to achieve is we try to take into account these two recent crises, which is the COVID crisis, which is the war in the Ukraine, to take a different perspective on energy systems, taking into account the large uncertainties or the ignorance, the unknown that is in these sectors. So it's no longer the case that, you know, we intend or we think we know what are potential dangers to the energy system, but what we rather do is we acknowledge there are so many different things that can go wrong, which are outside of our experience, and we are trying to shelter us from these unknowns. And that is the resilience, the idea of resilience, where you say, well, there are so many things we cannot control. What we are focusing on is what happens if the systems are down. So what happens after the event, and how can we restore fast the main functions of the system? And the main function is security of supply in electricity generation, security of supply in the electricity grid, and security and energy security in the supply of energy resources. And that explains a bit now as well the policy agenda that we are observing, because the policy agenda is about the availability of energy in various forms in sufficient quantity at reasonable, affordable prices at all times. And then, of course, in the, let's say, in the most tenuous energy carrier, which is gas, as you will see in Germany, this or in Europe, this means that we have to think about availability of energy in various forms. So this will be pipeline, that will be LNG, that might be, as I will talk about, that might be hydrogen. and different forms of synthetic fuels for the future, and insufficient quantities, meaning that we need more. We need a variety of different sources and at reasonable prices. And reasonable prices, I think, will be as well redefined a bit, because in principle, that does no longer mean that we are going to get the cheapest energy in our systems, but reasonable means that we get energy at prices that allow us for a stable economic and social development. So that means we will see prices much higher than the ones that we have seen in the past, where the German industry, for example, was basically built on the idea of cheap and unlimited gas from Russia. But now we'll see higher levels, and the challenge will be, how can we get a stable economic and social development in Europe or in Germany with the industrial transformation that is going to accompany these larger energy prices. Okay, so why are we so worried about all that? Well, we have a high energy import dependency in Europe. So almost a quarter of our energy came from Russia in 2020. And a lot from the rest of the world. Okay, only 40% came from Europe, and in Germany it's much worse. So you can see that on the right-hand side. I know some of you can read some German, so apologies to the rest. Oil, Germany fully dependent on oil from imports. Gas, 90% imported. About half of it from Russia. About 1/3 of the oil from Russia, and coal. Practically 100% of coal imported. We have some lignite coal, which we are still using, but hard coal is all imported. Okay, again, 60% from Russia. So these are incredibly large numbers, and I have to admit that this is a development that, let's say, accelerated in the last decade, mostly unscrutinized by the public. We have seen that, especially in the last decade, we have bought more and more gas, coal from Russia. One of my arguments would be that, we are talking a lot about the externality in climate change issues, we have as well here an externality in energy security. Well, of course, I have said this for a long time, but probably not with too much passion, because we have not seen this really realizing, but there is an energy security externality, and this can be seen in Germany, where the companies have just looked for the cheapest source of gas, okay, buying cheap gas, which privately makes fully sense, but from a societal point of view, this led us to a situation where we are heavily dependent on one supplier, which is Russia. So typical externality, individually fully rational behavior, leading to a socially unpleasant negative outcome. Okay, and we had a lot of, I will later show you some of the things that we have been doing, and this was countered by industry with relatively large resistance. And our argument was, well, if you are not willing to take part of the costs of this policy, then of course we as well have to think about how we are dealing with it in the future, because it cannot be that we have this externality and the individual companies, they refuse to be regulated in one way or the other. There is then a market failure, obviously, that has to be corrected. But this is something, as I said, for the future. Okay, so why is that all happening? Well, because a lot of these things are path dependent. And Germany, for example, over time has built up a lot of pipeline capacities. So we started with Druschba in the 80s, and then this was built up step by step. And now we have a lot of these main pipelines that are active, that are filling up Europe from, especially you've seen that from the north. So that would be UK, Norway, the Netherlands, and from the east and from the southeast. Okay, so these are the main pipelines. Of course, Turkey as well plays a big role there with the pipelines coming from Azerbaijan. And there's as well currently some discussion about the southeast corridors to Europe. And of course, there are these big pipelines from Russia via Ukraine, via Poland, and via the Baltic Sea. So currently I'm here a research fellow at the Krupp-Wissenschaftskolleg in Greifswald. And Greifswald is just the place where Lubmin is sitting. And this is the place where Nord Stream is hitting German ground. So this is Nord Stream 1. And of course, Nord Stream 2 is fully operational, but has never been activated, and probably will never be activated. But this is here the second string that is important, and this is the other important pipeline route from Norway. I told you we get as well some pipeline gas from the Netherlands, and as well, of course, via the sea routes. The gas from the Netherlands was actually scheduled to be terminated this year. They are going to continue using it, but there is as well some local resistance. Anyways, what we have to do is we have to think about how we restore our storage sites over the next month, and an important role is here played by LNG terminals. And I show you some of the LNG terminals. The red one, they are existing ones, and there are new ones planned. New LNG terminals, especially here in Germany, there are plans for 4 new LNG terminals. And this will be floating terminals. So the German government already bought the LNG ships for the terminals, and we think that this might be operational already by the end of the year. So it's getting quick. What would that mean? Well, that would mean that from these imports that are missing from Russia, we are going to potentially substitute some of these away with additional pipeline gas. Probably from Norway, probably from North Africa, probably from the Netherlands, probably from UK. We might get some additional LNG because some of these LNG terminals are not fully used in the past. They are, of course, now. There might be some new terminals going online. And overall, that means we are lacking. We have done an assessment where we assume 30% of our gas is actually missing in Germany, which would mean from the supply side, we have some gap that have to be filled by reductions in demand. And there are different calculations done. As I said, I was part of a group of people that wrote a paper that was called "What If the Economic Effects for Germany of a stop of energy imports from Russia, a paper that was, let's say, favorably discussed in political circles, but quite hostile discussed in political circles. So favorably in academic circles, hostile in political circles, because it put the German government under big pressure, because one of the outcomes of the study was that, well, if you handle this right, the economic impacts of a stop of Russian gas imports would be more or less on the level of the impacts of the corona crisis. Okay, so something that is serious, but something that is what we call manageable, because it would lead to a reduction of GDP of our calculation 3%, and then probably some repercussion on the demand side. So probably 5, 6, 7% of GDP losses, mainly, of course, in energy intensive industry that would be losing some gas. But we have seen that as well during the corona crisis. There are, of course, instruments to cope with this type of situation, and we were relatively optimistic that we would as well see a reshuffling of global value chains, that would help us to buffer these impacts, including as well some reductions in demand due to higher prices and potential mechanisms initiated by the German government. Okay, so this was the short-term perspective. Well, now we are about 4 months into this situation, and I would say, well, our calculations were somehow valid under the idea that we do everything that we have to do to cope with this situation, which would as well mean we do everything to rebalance our value chains, to save energy, and to get new sources. I think German government has mainly focused on the last part. So think about new supplies. And I think they were quite good in doing that with these new LNG terminals, with new pipeline gas that was acquired. But we have, I think, not really been doing good in reducing demand. So there has been some adjustment in demand, but not enough, which means that we are going to run into problems, especially as we have as well now some problems with LNG gas. We see that Russians are cutting down their gas supplies currently, and we are not really doing well in explaining that we are in a very specific situation. So our guess is that we are going to move into the next winter with a situation where we are still dependent on Russian gas, because we have not cut down demands sufficiently during the winter month, and we have not filled up our storage sites sufficiently such that we can really have autonomy, political autonomy or political sovereignty, as you might say, because we have still some dependence on gas flows in Russia, at least if we are not willing to really face substantial economic damages. Okay, so this was the short run. I think I spent too much time on the short run, but I want to say as well a few words on the long run, which would be more generally on this climate neutrality perspective and how we move into this climate neutrality. And I talked already about some of the win-wins where we are dealing with the impacts of the war and the other big crisis, which is the climate crisis, and align them. And from my perspective, this comprises 4 dimensions, which is the broad electrification of industry and the society, which means that, well, a key decarbonization strategy is trying to think about electrification of transport, industry, and buildings. We will need still a shift towards hydrogen and hydrogen-derived synthetic fuels. So in sectors where electrification is not possible, we will need the use of carbon capture and carbon use technologies, carbon capture and use and carbon capture and sequestration technologies to become carbon neutral. And we have to think about how we use better feedstocks or alternative fuels such as bioenergy, which will be very important also in many different applications. We see that already in Germany, where we see a lot of hope for bioenergy use in industry or biomass use in the electricity sector or in the heating sector and so forth. So these are the four big, I think, challenges. The problem is in most of these things, we are still not there also technology-wise and also not infrastructure-wise. So we will as well need a big boost in infrastructure, that is electricity infrastructure, electricity grid, hydrogen infrastructure, CO2 infrastructure. We have to transport CO2 as well, using these CCS technologies, for example. And we need the infrastructure also for charging, for example, and so forth, to enable these shifts that we need for climate neutrality. And of course, we will as well need a policy set that is not only built on markets and carbon pricing, but as well things about how we improve innovation activities. So I was just with a delegation of the German research minister to Australia on green hydrogen, where we see these markets are just emerging. And there's, of course, a lot of technological advance that is necessary to bite down the costs of these different alternatives. And we need a lot of this in the upcoming decade. Okay, and many of these things have to be tackled European. The renewable sector is gives a good idea of that. So in Germany, you will see we have massive renewable targets, but of course it's getting more and more difficult to deploy renewables in Germany, while on the European scale, we have, of course, a lot of opportunities for developing renewables. So what we need is, I think, to think broader about electrification, about renewables, not only narrowly on the member state level, which of course means that we need a much more European grid than we have today. We need also much better EU coordination, including offshore. Now we have started this with an offshore strategy in Germany, for example, and coordinated with some of our neighbors. But this can be only the beginning. It's really important. And we as well need, I think, more European-wide support of renewable build-out, because nowadays all member states have their own funding system. The German system was very generous in the past, which means we had a lot of extension, while in other countries we have a lot of potential, but not really good support, which means that they are lagging behind. There's much more potential that can be achieved in these countries, especially in the European South. Okay, so that's a European topic. I said the German plan is super ambitious. We want to get 80% of our electricity from renewable sources by 2030. It's getting hot in Germany, I have to say, so we're getting a bit more relaxed. And 100% in 2035, which means we intend to triple the speed of new installations for wind and PV. Yeah, so this is massive. The idea is that we are now defining renewables as an investment of public interest and national security concern, which helps, of course, if there are trade-off with environmental concerns, protection of species, and so forth. Okay, that will help us. It's as well a question of available land. So there will be as well new regulation that will assure larger possibilities for renewable investments because there is more land available. Okay, and the idea is, as I said, to overcome this old German market model, which is built on cheap gas, with a new market model built on renewables. No? But the problem, of course, is that this will take some time. And later on, I want to show you that we will really see very hard time for German industry with high energy prices, gas prices, electricity prices. And that might mean that we will also see a reshuffling of value chains, potentially. Depending on global perspective of cheap energy, cheap electricity, availability of, for example, green hydrogen. Okay, so I think in the long term we can fix some of this, because in the long term I would argue we can develop these green hydrogen markets, and we can develop the renewable markets in Europe that provide us with cheap electricity. But in the intermediate phase, we will see a lot of problems with high prices. Okay. Then of course there's as well a lot about energy savings, but not a lot concrete. So I'm going to jump over this. So everything is more or less boiling down to some campaigns and some behavioral interventions in the short run. So not a lot to be expected. As I said, this is one of the big shortcomings. There will be more on the building side coming up in the future. So we have ambitious targets for heat pump investments, for example. We have for the new heating systems starting 2024, 65% has to come from renewable heating, which means that you basically cannot longer install a fossil fuel-based heating system in Germany starting 2024, and there will be as well new building codes and so forth. No? But this will all be longer term. Another thing that's important in the longer term is everything that has to do with hydrogen. We think that there is some potential for hydrogen generation also in Europe that can be used especially for industry. So for refineries, for steel production, for fertilizer production, and for part of the mobility sector, especially for ships, for trains, for heavy transport. Okay, there are other possibilities which might not be competitive, especially in the heating sector and in the transport sector, where most people would think it's mainly direct electrification. And then there are some areas which I will show you in a second where it's not really clear whether it's going to be direct electrification or indirect electrification via hydrogen. In any case, we know that all these ambitions are high, but they are still not in line with what we want to achieve because there are so high needs, for example, from industry for decarbonization linked to green hydrogen, for example. So here I show you the German hydrogen strategy. This has been adapted already a bit in terms of electrolyzer capacities, but this is still not sufficient to cover all the needs of industry. So we think that probably 2/3 of hydrogen is going to be imported from different areas of the world where there is more renewables, more cheap renewable, and where it can be transported easily to Germany. Okay, so as I said, there are some sectors that will be more hydrogen-based, some sectors that will be electrified, and most of these volume has to be imported, and this is shown here. Here you see this are scenarios for the German economy, where you see there are there's some part where electrification is more or less assumed in all simulations, which is cars and buildings, so heat pumps, okay? And there is some hydrogen use in all simulation, which is mainly industry, air transport, and ships, okay? And then the interesting part is there is about 1/3 of energy demand is still undecided, which is, for example, heavy transport or process heat in industry, where it's not fully clear whether this will be a direct electricity or that would go via hydrogen. So this is something we don't know, which is of course also relevant then for building up infrastructure, for example, and so forth. And this will be a large part of the ongoing discussion. It's also important to think about, and now these are my last 2 slides, to think about how we are dealing with this diversification in the future. I already talked about the LNG import terminals that we are currently planning in Germany, 2 to 4 probably floating LNG terminals. And we are as well discussing about these new green hydrogen markets and how we are going to structure them, because as I said, what we do not want to do is do not want to replicate the situation of the gas markets. That's probably not so difficult to prevent, because the supply structure in the hydrogen market will be more diverse, because it's not only the owners of fossil fuel resources, but it's broader, whoever has cheap electricity, heat, sun and wind. Okay, so this is more diverse, but still you have to be cautious also to really weigh in these political risks. So for example, it would not be a good idea to cut ties to Russia and then, let's say, engage heavily with Saudi Arabia, for example. And this is what, or Qatar, no? Which is currently a big discussion, because the Qataris, of course, want the German industry to sign 20-year contracts, okay, for their gas. And they are very reluctant to do that, given not only the political risks that might be involved, we see this already a bit, no, but also, of course, I mean, this is going to set long-term obligations in geostrategic, unstable regions potentially, no? And that's the reason why our delegation visited Australia, because we are convinced that that transport will not be a big problem in the future. So you can also transport hydrogen and synthetic fuels over longer distances in the future, which means that you might look at supplier countries that provide a good market environment with little political risks. Okay, but okay, we have to reevaluate these supplier countries. We have to think about diversification that will, of course, lead to higher import costs if we diversify, will as well potentially take higher time. So think about now Germany has a lot of engagement with Africa. So Western Africa is, of course, a good place for hydrogen generation, but if you think about it, no, you don't have infrastructure there, you don't have the fitting port infrastructure and so forth. That all takes a lot of time to really implement these large investments. Of course, the situation in the Ukraine is shifting also more potential, more interest to the EU. Because then you think, what are our European possibilities, to deal with the issue? And it's also making synthesis products more attractive, because it will be easier to supply or to use ammonium, for example, or methanol where the transport problems are less drastic than with hydrogen, and the infrastructure is already in place and working. So the rebalancing in the hydrogen game might be more looking towards EU sources and more looking to synthesis products to start with. And the other problem, of course, is that well, our idea was always that we have some type of transition to this hydrogen economy via gray or blue hydrogen. So we could develop infrastructure, we could invest in new steel plants and so forth that, for example, are using direct reduction technology. So they are using hydrogen, but they are probably not using green hydrogen because we don't have green hydrogen. They are using gray or blue hydrogen. But this bridge will be now very difficult because the hydrogen coming from natural gas is so expensive that it's even more expensive than the green hydrogen. Okay, and the green hydrogen is much more expensive than what they are currently doing in terms of technology, which is coal-based, which means we are in a bad spot at the moment because we are losing this possibility to transfer and as well build hydrogen infrastructure that can be then make green in a second step. So this is really a problem that as well has to be considered. And then my last slide, just a short look on the next years. And here I show you gas and electricity prices. And of course, you know, in Europe, they are skyrocketing. So here you see the gas prices, spot market prices, and here you see the electricity prices in Germany. So we are coming out of a system with here prices on the wholesale market of around 40 to 50 euro per megawatt hour. And here these are tidal transport facility TTF prices of around 20. And now we talk about quadrupling gas prices, and we talk about electricity prices that are around 200 euro per megawatt hour. So 5 times the level that we are used to, okay? And you can see that, yes, the markets think that this is going to be rectified somehow. So I show you here different delivery years. So this is delivery in 2023, 2024, 2025 gas delivery. Now, so this is going to come down, but it's not coming down anywhere to pre-war levels. Okay, so even in 2025, so 3 years from now, gas prices will be 2 to 3 times the level of the pre-war level, and electricity prices would be 3 times what we had before war. Okay, and that of course will be really tough for many of the German companies, but as well for the German households, because they are going to face these high prices not only for a year or two, but they are going to face that for a longer period of time. And we have to tell them now that these high prices are not going to disappear, but they're going to stay there for a long, long time. And then, of course, the question will be, can Germany deliver on its renewable policy? So can we really build out renewables as far as projected? Because that would bring down prices substantially. And can we really develop alternatives to gas and coal, which means that can we really deliver on this hydrogen strategy and to what prices? Okay, so this is all totally unclear. I told you that we are here following these political targets in this monitoring of the energy transition. There is an own commission that was appointed by the German cabinet in 2011. And as I said, we do yearly reports. Now with the new government, we have to see whether we can do another report end of the year. But of course, we are following these different developments because many of these things are really unclear. At the moment, and I would not bet on the speed of renewable extension and the speed of hydrogen expansion. And then there are, of course, another large list of open issues that I already talked about a bit, the ETS, the carbon pricing, ETS2, the border carbon adjustment mechanism, the taxonomy has just been voted down in Parliament this week, with a decision not to include gas investments and nuclear investments as sustainable investments under the EU taxonomy. So we don't really know what is going to happen there because, as you know, there is a multi-layer process in the EU where the different institutions have to agree, and also the EU Council has to, of course, agree on these things, and the EU Parliament still undecided about the direction. Okay, so this was a bit a broader perspective view on what we are currently discussing. Of course, as I said, probably a bit subjective given things that I'm working on, I'm interested in. So I'm looking very much to some discussion and probably as well some perspectives from Turkey on what I just said. Thanks a lot.
Many thanks, Andreas, for that tour. You have covered from short to long run, from economics to policy, from market to energy to technology. We really appreciate all your effort and all the information that you have provided us. Many thanks. Colleagues, the floor is for you now to share your questions, comments, observations with Professor Löschel. Ebru, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Andreas. I mean, this has been really, really influential and useful for us. So I was just going to ask about the trade-offs that you have mentioned in your last slide, right? So you mentioned that these rising prices in gas and electricity markets could go both ways, right? It might just positively impact the renewables policy, but it might also set it back because of the dependency on coal and gas, and it might set the policy back to the fossil fuels as well. So I know the German society is a bit different from the rest of the Europe. So it had a large impact, these price increases on the French elections, and it was part of the discussion. But to what extent do you think it's going to affect the discussions, and it's affecting the discussions in Germany in terms of the effect of these prices and the society's reaction to that? Not the industry, but at the household level as well.
Yeah, well, I would as well include the industry, because I think in Germany, this trade-off, from my perspective, is not so pronounced. I think this detrimental trade-off is much more important in many of the developing and emerging economies. There, I really think if we talk about global climate policy, we are really in a very bad situation. I mean, I'm as well part of the Japanese Energy Council. I mean, if you talk with Japanese people, I mean, they are fully, I mean, they are surrounded by all countries that are moving back now to coal. So the competitive environment is, of course, totally different. And in Germany, I think that is not the case, at least not to this extent. Why? Because the German government is really dedicated to the climate targets. And Germany is a wealthy country, so they can, I mean, they can accommodate many of these things. No, I mean, we had now, I think, the biggest package on support for industry and households with I think 40 billion that was that's going to be distributed as support measures, and it's going to be just the beginning. So we are in a good situation, and so therefore I would say these trade-offs are not so pronounced, especially since, let's say, with the emissions trading system, we have, I think, a good instrument as well to cope with increased coal use. I mean, I advise to use more coal, for example, much more than we do at the moment. Why? Because under the EU ETS, we know that this is kept. So if we use more coal today because we have a crisis, that means we can use less coal in the future. Okay, because we have a cap, no, that is there. And so given the special situation, for example, I do not understand why the German government has put a lot of coal power plants still in reserve. They're not participating in the market. I think they should push it to the market, no, and should let them operate in order to minimize gas use in electricity markets, for example. Not only Germany, but actually all over Europe. The reason is that this trade-off is less pronounced because we have the ETS. So the ETS is helping us on that, no, and we should use it. While I think in the emerging economies, in the developing countries, no, you don't have these mechanisms in place, so they are going to really increase emissions. It's not the case for Europe. And the second thing concerning, let's say, renewable support, now what you see is that actually the industry is one of the big supporters of this renewable build-out. Why? Well, because they see that with more renewables, that is the possibility to get low electricity prices. Now, what they want to do is, of course, they want to rely more heavily on power purchase agreements in the future, which means that they push the government heavily to really allow more renewable build out for the future in order to secure low cost renewable electricity. Okay, so I've not, I mean, of course, you want to make sure that that the system adequacy is there, no, but the more renewable electricity is in the system, the better it is. And now the resistance comes more from, I would say, from the local level. So people that are locally resisting renewable investments, especially in wind farms. And therefore, the German government's targets have been reshuffled. So now our biggest increase in renewables is in solar PV, rooftop PV, because there, of course, the resistance now is going to be smaller, low, and now we have moved to target. So we want to quadruple the installation of PV from 50 to 200 gigawatt in the next 8 years. Something that is, I would say, unthinkable, at least from my perspective. We'll see what happens, but they want to build 20 gigawatts new PV rooftop, as well as some large-scale PV land-based, but no longer, let's say, a focus on wind, which would be, from an economic perspective, of course, the better solution. And we see more investments or more targets for offshore wind, also because of acceptance problems in onshore wind build-out. So as I said, I mean, the industry is actually supportive. The household on the local levels, they are against, but more generally, I think there is an understanding that renewables are part of the solution, and we can afford it as well.
I see. So you're kind of saying that the German society is kind of aware of the short run versus long run trade-offs of the repercussions of the Russian invasion in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, also in the short run, I mean, I would say the renewable build-out is not a short-run solution, no, because it will take time anyway. So it's always a medium to long-term solution, because even if the government now would be enacting this Easter package and the summer package and so forth, no, this will take time. The project pipelines are relatively thin, no, still. So you would think that it will take time to fly. As I said, I'm a bit puzzled how this should be. And the other problem, of course, is there's a lot of resistance in providing enough space for renewables from local authorities. And the problem is, as you know, as economists, if there is a scarce resource, in this case, land, the scarce resource is going to take the rents. Which means that the industry is now really annoyed by very high prices for PPAs. So the idea that the generation or the production of renewables is relatively cheap is only true if there is no constraining factor. And at the moment, the constraining factor is land. And so that means this competition is not really very strong, and they're asking very high prices also for PPAs, because they see that, of course, on the markets, the electricity prices are skyrocketing now. So they ask very, very high electricity prices also in the bilateral agreements. So we really have to work on these frameworks, and that will take time.
So I have questions, but I should leave the floor to the other people as well.
Anyone would like to step in before Ebru Hoca, Bengisu?
Maybe, yes, I will. So Andreas, thank you for your presentation. It was very useful, but I'd like to go back to your comments on CBAM at the very beginning. You said that it will be hard to implement, it will be difficult to extend the scope because it's not getting a lot of support. By the extent of the scope, do you mean the sectoral scope, or do you mean the emission scope? Do you expect the scope of the CBAM to extend to scope 1 to scope 2 emissions? Because it would be interesting to see its effects in the Turkish policy, because I mean, that's how we got into the climate policy this far.
No, I mean, of course, the idea is scope 3 emissions, but the problem a bit is that it will basically, I guess, it will basically be on some type of standards, that will be implemented, and these technology standards will have to be somehow linked to state of technologies, and that means yes, that will be relevant if the sectors are under this regulation, but I mean, there's also some discussion. I also had a paper on that once on, I mean, the real accounting of the emissions abroad, which would of course have as well much higher impact on the source countries in terms of reducing emissions, and this is most likely not going to happen. So that means, I mean, you will have to beat probably some standard okay, but if you are below these, you don't get any extra benefit, no, from going further. There is still a discussion. I mean, I was involved also in some projects for DG Energy where we try to discuss that a bit. But the problem is they think, or I think many people think that this is too prone to manipulation. And therefore, and resourcing and all this type of things, no. So that I guess we will have a relatively simplistic measurement of emissions along the value chains, and I think it will be as well the scope in terms of the sectors will be relatively limited because exactly of this, no. So if there are complex products. Then, of course, you would be interested in the full value chains. That will be very difficult. So probably you are going to stay with simple products. And that's, of course, going to all hamper the effectiveness, no, of the CBAM approach. And I mean, let's say a pessimistic view would be you're ending up only with, let's say, simplistic sectors with relatively shallow value chains in products that are not really traded heavily with your main trading partners, no, because you are you're unwilling to take up fights, no, trade fights with these trading partners, and that would mean it's probably much less effective, no, than it is envisaged by some. And that's, I think, as well the reason why industry is so much pushing for keeping free allocations, because if they are not sheltered through a broad and deep system, then they are, of course, really open to international competition with countries that are having a soft climate regulation. And we think that this will be in the future, of course, a real threat. That was what I was trying to elaborate, a real threat, because it might be that, on the global scale, things are going to diverge. I talked a bit about my Japanese experience, not to talk about Indonesia, about China, about other regions in the world that are going to look for cheap energy resources, potentially as well with use of CCS and other things, but will have a much larger advantage in terms of energy prices than we are seeing it today.
Mm-hmm. But that's interesting, right? Because actually there is also the signaling function of CBAM, which seems to be currently dominating the whole climate policy design in Turkey. I mean, if there is any Turkish politician that was hearing your talk, it would really encourage them not to do anything, because it seems that the CBAM and the threat is really keeping the energy of the climate policies here in Turkey, that the fear of it, right? So that would really, I mean, if the preferences move towards the free allowance in Europe, then that would also give a very strong signaling effect to the third parties, no?
Yeah. I mean, this is now my personal judgment, no. So, and I guess it's not in line with the official publications or whatever, no. But that's just my personal judgment. I think I would still not underestimate the dynamics, because of course CBAM is not everything. And if you think about the transformation of our different sectors, then we see, of course, that this is only one building block, that is driving the development. So now, as I said, all German industry wants to become climate neutral, carbon neutral. And that means that they are, of course, really clearly monitoring their emissions. 1, 2, 3. And of course, I mean, that is something that is potentially not part of CBAM, but will mean that there is as well from the demand side a clear idea that we are willing to pay a margin for green products, that industry is going to source from countries that provide clean intermediates, and of course that might be a very strong motivation as well for other countries to comply with this agenda. So it's what I want to say, it's not only the stick that is the CBAM, but it's as well the carrot, which is that, of course, there is a shift in consumer sentiment or consumer perspectives that I would not underestimate at the moment. And of course, it's always difficult now to project this into the future, but I think we are seeing dynamics also here in Europe, especially in Germany, where, of course, let's say the climate discussion is now on a totally different level than 20 years before when we were sitting together in Mannheim. So these things are now, I mean, really part of, let's say, standard economic and social policy making. And I, as I said, I mean, I would not underestimate this driver. And of course, as I said, I don't know. I mean, the idea of the CBAM regulation is very broad. And I told you from my perspective, when I was part of these different advisory things for the Commission, I think the Commission is especially eager, as I said, to generate some new revenue streams via these instruments. But I mean, we'll see. Probably it's going to be stricter than I said. But we don't know. I mean, this is fully open. I mean, I think it's good now that this is brought on the table and they are convinced or they are really convinced that they should do something. I think that's good. I think we should work more on equalizing ambition. So I think it would be much better to get other countries in agreeing on more ambition, so the climate club thing, and that would help us because we would not have to use the stick that much because we are more or less moving in the same direction. But as I said, internationally, in the current situation, I would think that this is not going to happen.
Colleagues, any final comment, observation? Andreas, may I ask a very quick question from your short-term implications, the immediate impact of about the impact of the Russian gas halting, a sudden stop on the potential effect on the German economy.
Yeah.
I was intrigued to hear from you that the domestic proportion of energy security in Germany is quite low, almost at par with the Turkish one. And I am sure that if Ebru and Bengüsü would make a quick CG modeling of the sudden stop of the gas imports, Turkish economy will just decline by more than 20% upon impact. And in comparison, your upon impact value had been quite shallow, if I may say so, about 1 to 3% of the GDP. I know that this takes a long analysis, but what drives this result? Are there any substitution possibilities in the background, or
So I think we know that from CGE models. We usually know it from the other perspective, that climate policy doesn't cost a lot. Okay, why? Because the energy sector usually is around 2% of GDP. Okay, so if you're messing with this sector and you have some substitution possibilities in your sectoral composition, you would expect that these costs are not going to be tremendous. And I think that's behind a lot of the assessments for climate policy, which are, I think, to some extent, all delivering low-cost estimations, because they are built on input-output tables where energy is simply not important. Okay, now you can of course argue whether this is right and this is giving the right value to energy. Okay, but this is just the construction of these things. So we have done some sensitivity analysis, and there of course what you can see is these costs can go up to 10%. Okay, if you distribute differently the losses in gas. So for example, if you distribute, I show some slide how gas is used. Well, gas is used heavily in the building sector, okay? A bit in energy and then in industry. Now, the idea behind these calculations is that, let's say, we are cutting gas efficiently, which means we are not cutting it in industry, because industry has the highest value added out of this gas. Okay, we are cutting it more in other sectors. I talked a bit about coal. Okay, but it's especially in the building sector. In the building sector, that is all comfort losses. Okay, which of course, as we know, this is has a welfare attribute to it. Okay, but it's relatively cheap. Okay, so for example, you can have really substantial benefits by cutting thermostats in Germany by 2 degrees or 1 or 2 degrees. Okay, so that would bring down really gas demand substantially, and there are a lot of possibilities to reduce building gas demand. Okay, so the idea behind many of these simulations is that it's done where it's cheapest. Okay, the problem in reality is that this is not going to happen, because we have a law that is giving priority in gas supply to households, then to electricity generation, and then to industry, which means the first that are going to be cut off is industry. And the last one is households. So therefore, I advise the government to really think hard how to incentivize households to cut down their emission or their demand before we are running into problems. Okay, because what I just showed, 3 to 6%, this all means we are not under this stupid regulation, okay, where we cut industry, but we do something between. And the problem is that the households by construction, they do not see energy prices, as you know better than I do. They simply don't get this relationship between energy prices and behavior. We had just a paper in GEAM last year where we showed this for electricity demand. Nobody knows electricity prices and electricity consumption. Okay, so how would you expect people are making rational decisions based on prices if they don't even know their electricity bills? Okay, so therefore you would really have to substantially incentivize reductions in these sectors, and you cannot just wait for market mechanisms to kick in, because they are somehow delayed. And of course industry is doing that, but the big chunk of this demand comes from household. And the German government has decided that they are not going to intervene substantially, but more or less they started an advertisement campaign last week. Okay, we now should all save energy, but this is not going to do the job. And that means if we are running in physical problems, then these costs are going to skyrocket. Okay, and yeah, that explains a bit the numbers, and explains also a bit our worries, because we think that these numbers, these are, optimal scenario. Policy is really doing its job, and it's only partly doing its job, or it's not doing its job.
No, terrific. No, it definitely explains more than the numbers. It explains more or less the main portion of the story. As a matter of fact, that our models are just in most of the time in a vacuum. Everything is nice, smooth, no bottlenecks, smooth optimization transitions. That's fair argument. Andreas, many thanks. I mean, we are really happy, lucky to have you on board today with us, for your effort, for your candid and sincere evaluation of the whole thing from your own perspective, as well as from an analytics and academic point of view. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I learned that you are working on this issue also in the upcoming months and years. So yeah, let's keep in contact.
Thank you so much.
Be in touch. We'll definitely be after you, chasing you with your comments, guidance. Definitely.
Very
Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much, Andreas. Nice to see you.
And thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Okay, and dear colleagues, thank you for your attention, for being with us today, and hope to see you in our presentations next week and beyond. Andreas, stay safe.
Yes, you too. Take care.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye now.